Near Iran's southern coast, the message is not arriving through a speech, a treaty, or another round of careful diplomatic language. It is waiting in plain sight. A United States Marine Expeditionary Unit is sitting close enough to the Strait of Hormuz to make every radar operator, naval commander, and political hardliner in Tehran understand the same uncomfortable truth. The ceasefire may exist on paper, but the next mistake at sea may be answered by something far more serious than another warning statement. That is the truth officials prefer to soften. The official language still talks about restraint, negotiations, and preserving regional stability. But the sea tells a harder story. Ships have been hit, drones have been launched, airstrikes have answered airstrikes. Tankers that should have been moving quietly through one of the world's most important shipping lanes are now limping towards safer ports, with smoke on their decks and emergency reports trailing behind them. If this is peace, it is the kind of peace that keeps its finger near the trigger. The Strait of Hormuz has always been narrow enough to make governments nervous. A large share of global energy traffic squeezes through that corridor, and every country with fuel prices, shipping contracts, or military interests has a reason to watch it closely. But in the days after the supposed ceasefire, the tension did not ease. It hardened. A Singapore-flagged cargo ship was reportedly struck by a one-way attack drone while trying to exit along the Omani side, the route many crews believed would be safer. Days later, a Panama-flagged crude tanker carrying Qatari oil was hit as well. Regional governments issued condemnations. Maritime agencies raised threat levels. The sense of danger that was supposed to fade after the agreement only became more visible. Every time Iran, or the forces tied to its security network, pushed the line, the United States answered with action rather than speeches. Missile storage sites, drone facilities, coastal radar positions, and command nodes turned into targets. These were not symbolic strikes aimed at creating headlines for one news cycle. They were aimed at the tools Iran needs to keep pressure on commercial shipping without openly declaring a wider war. That is what makes the pattern so important. The strikes were not random. They followed a logic. Find the system that enables harassment in the strait, break the system, and do it before Iran can rebuild enough confidence to try again. So the question becomes obvious. If both sides signed an understanding to reduce hostilities, why are ships still being attacked? Why are American aircraft still hitting military targets? Why is CENTCOM still publishing images that signal force rather than calm? And why, less than 2 weeks after the ink dried on a peace arrangement, is a full Marine Expeditionary Unit now positioned off Iran's coastline? The simplest answer is that the ceasefire was never really a finish line. It was a pause button. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps appears to have treated that pause as something to test, not something to respect. Push here, probe there, see how much Washington will tolerate, then claim the response is an escalation. That kind of pressure campaign only works when the other side is unsure what it is willing to do. The arrival of the 31st of Marine Expeditionary Unit changes that calculation. It does not have to shout. Its presence is the message. To understand why, the sequence matters. Earlier in the month, after a short but brutal conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran, a memorandum of understanding was presented as a way to bring the fighting down and reopen the Strait of Hormuz to full commercial traffic. On paper, it sounded neat. It suggested closure. It suggested that both sides had decided the risk of escalation was too high. But agreements are only as strong as the behavior that follows them, and the behavior that followed was not the behavior of a region settling down. Almost immediately, Tehran began signaling that it might revive transit fees once a temporary suspension expired. That may sound technical, but in the Strait of Hormuz, it is explosive. Washington's position was simple. International waters do not become a toll road because Iran says so. Tehran's position was wrapped in claims about services and control. The disagreement was not just about money. It was about who gets to decide the rules in a waterway the entire global economy depends on. Before another drone was even launched, the so-called peace was already drifting toward confrontation. Then came the attack on the commercial vessel moving along the Omani coast. The location mattered because it was supposed to be the safer lane. If a ship can be hit while using the route designed to reduce risk, then the threat is no longer theoretical. It means someone is deliberately trying to remind every captain, insurer, and government that Iran can still make the strait feel unsafe whenever it chooses. CENTCOM described the attack as a violation. Washington responded with strikes against the military infrastructure that makes such attacks possible. For a short moment, it looked as if that might be enough. It was not. The Revolutionary Guard answered with attempted strikes against American positions in Kuwait and Bahrain. The drones reportedly did not reach their targets, and there were no American casualties. But the absence of casualties should not distract from the point. Iran was not simply trying to cause damage. It was trying to show its domestic audience and regional allies that it could still hit back. In the logic of authoritarian power, the image of defiance can matter almost as much as the result. Less than 48 hours later, another tanker was struck. Regional governments were no longer dealing with a single isolated event. They were watching a pattern take shape. Bahrain condemned the attacks. Kuwait condemned them. Egypt condemned them. Maritime authorities trying to move stranded vessels through alternative routes had to reconsider whether any route could be considered safe. The threat level was not going down after the ceasefire, it was going up. That is why the phrase, "the war is over," sounds increasingly hollow. If the war were truly over, American aircraft would not keep hitting similar categories of targets in response to new attacks. Maritime agencies would not be raising risk levels. Commercial crews would not be calculating whether a routine transit might turn into an emergency. And a Marine Expeditionary Unit would not be sitting offshore in a posture that exists for one reason: to give national leaders options when the situation might move faster than diplomats can talk. This is no longer just about retaliation. It is about leverage. And the biggest piece of leverage on Iran's side of the board has a name most casual observers barely know: Kharg Island. Kharg Island sits off Iran's coast, and for Tehran, it is far more than a small dot in the Gulf. It is the heart valve of the country's oil export system. A major share of Iran's oil revenue depends on the ability to move crude through facilities connected to that island. Every barrel that reaches a buyer overseas helps keep the regime's finances alive. That makes Kharg both valuable and vulnerable. It is an economic artery sitting within reach of the kind of force designed to operate from the sea without asking anyone for permission. The island's importance is not only commercial. Satellite imagery and regional reporting have long pointed to the way Iran blends military assets with civilian infrastructure. Radar systems, communications equipment, defensive positions, naval facilities, and launch-related infrastructure can sit close to export terminals and port facilities. That arrangement is not accidental. It creates a dilemma for any adversary. Strike the military assets and risk being accused of attacking civilian energy infrastructure. Hold back, and Iran gets to use the protection of civilian cover while continuing a shadow campaign at sea. It is a gamble, and for years it may have looked like a clever one. But that gamble weakens when a force arrives that does not rely on a friendly airfield, does not need weeks of visible buildup, and can combine surveillance, raids, aviation, and logistics from ships at sea. A Marine Expeditionary Unit is built for exactly that kind of problem. It is not just a symbol. It is a toolbox for coercion, rescue, seizure, reconnaissance, and strike support. Move along the coast, and the map becomes even more sensitive. Bandar Abbas, Iran's primary naval port, is one of the most strategically important military locations in the country. It is associated with naval basing, fast attack craft, helicopters, missile defenses, and units tied to the Revolutionary Guard's maritime operations. In plain terms, it is part of the network that gives Iran the ability to threaten ships without always presenting a conventional navy in the open. Fast boats, drones, mines, coastal radars, and mobile launch sites together create a low-grade threat environment that can be dialed up or down depending on Tehran's political needs. That is the system Washington appears to be targeting peace by. Peace, not the country in a broad, uncontrolled way, but the machinery that allows Iran to keep the Strait of Hormuz under pressure. The assumption behind Iran's strategy seems to be that many of these assets are too mixed into civilian or dual-use areas to be hit. Without political cost, the last few weeks have challenged that assumption. Several rounds of strikes have shown that the United States is willing to hit military nodes when it believes they are directly tied to attacks on shipping. This is where the 31st of Marine Expeditionary Unit becomes more than another show of force. A carrier strike group can project enormous power. Long-range bombers can make headlines. But a Marine Expeditionary Unit brings something different. The ability to appear at the edge of a crisis with troops, aircraft, boats, intelligence teams, and its own sustainment system already packaged together. It is a compact military ecosystem designed to move quickly, operate independently, and create uncertainty for the opponent. The 31st MEO is not a new toy rolled out for cameras. It is part of a doctrine the United States has refined for decades. Keep a ready, self-contained force at sea that can respond before a crisis becomes uncontrollable. Roughly 2,200 Marines and sailors form the core of such a unit. They are organized into pieces that function together: a ground combat element, an aviation combat element, a logistics combat element, and a command element tying the whole operation together. That structure is what gives the MEU its reputation. It can fight, move, scout, sustain, and command without waiting for a perfect land base. The ground combat element provides the Marines who can seize, secure, or raid an objective. The aviation element brings aircraft that can move troops, provide attack support, lift equipment, and conduct strikes. Depending on the configuration, that can include F-35B stealth fighters, MV-22 Ospreys, heavy lift helicopters, and attack helicopters. The logistics element keeps the operation alive, supplying fuel, ammunition, maintenance, medical support, and everything else that turns a dramatic landing into a sustainable mission. The command element fuses intelligence, communications, planning, and control. That last point matters because modern operations are not won simply by having weapons nearby. They are won by knowing where to apply pressure, when to move, and how to avoid walking into traps. Iran's coastal defense network is not a cartoon villain's fortress, with everything conveniently lined up. In the open, it is mobile, layered, and often hidden. Radar sites can shift. Drone launch systems can be concealed. Boats can disperse. Command nodes can move into hardened areas or civilian adjacent spaces. Against that kind of threat, intelligence is not a supporting role. It is the spine of the operation. The ships that carry a MEU, such as amphibious assault ships, are often described as smaller aircraft carriers. But that description only tells part of the story. They can launch aircraft from the flight deck while also using a well deck to move. Landing craft and vehicles. That combination creates an unusual kind of pressure. The same sea base can support air operations, reconnaissance, raids, evacuations, and limited ground action. It gives Washington choices that do not depend entirely on whether a regional government grants access to a runway. At the decisive moment, the F-35B is central to that flexibility. Its ability to take off from short decks and land vertically allows it to operate from amphibious ships rather than only from large carriers or fixed air bases. In a theater like the Gulf, where basing access is politically sensitive and flight paths can carry their own diplomatic complications, that matters. A stealth aircraft operating from the sea is not just another plane. It is a way of reducing dependence on someone else's permission, paired with other aircraft dedicated to suppressing enemy air defenses. The effect becomes sharper. Before any risky move against coastal targets, air defenses must be mapped, disrupted, or destroyed. Radar sites, surface-to-air missile batteries, and gun positions are not background details. They are the difference between a clean operation and a disaster. A MEU does not replace larger air power, but it complements it by putting a ready force close enough to exploit openings when they appear. Yet, the part of the MEU that should worry Tehran most may not be the aircraft. It is the quieter component, reconnaissance, and raid forces trained to move before everyone else. Marine Force reconnaissance and maritime raid force capabilities are built around the idea that assumptions kill operations. These teams can scout landing zones, survey defenses, conduct raids, board vessels, and gather information in places where satellites may not answer every question. They are the people who can confirm what is really there before a larger force commits. In a crisis around Kharg Island or Bandar Abbas, that kind of ground truth would be priceless. A satellite image can show structures, signals intelligence can suggest activity, drones can provide patterns. But a trained reconnaissance element can help answer the questions that decide whether an operation is possible, where the defenses actually are, which routes are exposed, which areas are mined, which facilities are active, which are decoys, and where a small force could move without being detected. Small drones add another layer. Modern marine units increasingly rely on runway, independent unmanned systems that can feed live surveillance back to commanders at sea. That means the force offshore is not blind between satellite passes. It can watch, adjust, and build a fresher picture of the battlefield. That is especially important against an opponent that tries to hide equipment underground, move launchers quickly, or rebuild sites in the gaps between strikes. This is why the MIU's presence changes how every headline from the region should be read. It is not only a warning, it is a preparation platform. It gives the United States the ability to escalate in carefully measured steps if Tehran keeps testing the ceasefire. It also gives Washington a way to respond without immediately depending on massive troop deployments or public negotiations over base access. That is the uncomfortable part for Iran. The force is already close. It is already organized. It is already designed for the exact kind of coastal problem Iran has created. Iranian officials seem to understand this, even when their public language tries to project confidence. Some have argued that the Strait of Hormuz is effectively governed by Iran, warning the United States not to confuse Iranian control with escalation. Others have accused Washington of violating the agreement by maintaining a military presence and conducting strikes. But the contradiction is hard to miss. Iran wants to claim special control over one of the world's most vital international waterways, while also portraying itself as the victim when its military infrastructure is hit after attacks on shipping. That is not diplomacy in the normal sense. It is narrative warfare. Tehran needs to tell its own public that it is resisting foreign pressure. It needs to tell regional partners that it still has teeth. It needs to tell the world that American responses are aggression rather than consequences. But the physical evidence keeps complicating that story. Attacked ships, intercepted drones, destroyed military nodes, and a growing maritime security posture that suggests nobody responsible believes the danger has passed. Even the uncertainty around future diplomatic talks tells its own story. When officials cannot clearly say whether a scheduled meeting will happen, that is not always clever strategy. Sometimes it means the government itself is divided between those who want to lower the temperature and those who believe escalation is necessary to preserve influence. In Iran's case, that internal divide has always mattered. The political wing may want economic relief and a path away from pressure. The Revolutionary Guard may want to prove that pressure can still be exported outward. The result is a state that speaks in two voices and expects the world to pretend that is a plan. For the United States, the structural problem is brutal but clear. There is a hostile coastline filled with mobile radars, drone storage sites, mine-laying capabilities, fast attack craft, and command nodes. Beside that coastline runs one of the most important energy corridors on Earth. A direct overreaction could ignite a wider war. Too little reaction could make every ship in the strait a bargaining chip. The challenge is to punish the tools of harassment without letting the situation spin completely out of control. That explains the rhythm of the recent American response. Identify the source of the threat, strike the infrastructure, then keep enough force nearby to make the next warning credible. Suppression comes first. Intelligence comes next. Precision follows. It is not glamorous, and it is not the kind of thing that fits neatly into a 30-second news Summary. But it is how modern coercion works. The public sees the explosions. The real work happens in surveillance feeds, target folders, maritime alerts, and quiet command rooms. Iran's advantage has been geography. It lives beside the strait. Its forces know the coastline. Its smaller platforms can appear and disappear quickly. Its commanders understand that global markets react to fear almost as much as they react to actual damage. A single damaged tanker can move insurance rates, unsettle shipping companies, and remind oil buyers that the Gulf is never just a local problem. That is the pressure Tehran knows how to create. America's answer is mobility. A Marine Expeditionary Unit offshore reduces Iran's comfort zone. It means the United States does not have to telegraph every move through large land deployments. It means Washington can keep a force close enough to respond, but flexible enough to avoid being trapped into one option. It means Tehran has to wonder whether the next drone attack might be answered not only by another airstrike, but by a raid, a seizure, a blockade action, or a direct move against the assets Iran assumed were protected by proximity to civilian infrastructure. That uncertainty is the point. Deterrence is not only about promising punishment. It is about making the other side unsure which form that punishment will take. If Iran knows the response will always be a limited strike on an empty storage shed, it can adapt. If it has to worry that the response might include reconnaissance teams, precision strikes, maritime interdiction, and the temporary seizure or disabling of a sensitive facility, the calculation changes. Suddenly, the cost of another small attack may not feel small at all. Kharg Island remains the symbol of that calculation. No one should pretend that striking or seizing parts of such a sensitive energy hub would be simple or without consequences. It would carry enormous political, economic, and military risk. But the fact that it sits within reach is enough to shape behavior. You do not always need to fire the weapon for the weapon to matter. Sometimes positioning the force is the message, and the message is understood perfectly by everyone who needs to hear it. Bandar Abbas sends a similar signal. If Iran's naval pressure campaign depends on fast boats, drones, coastal radars, and command facilities tied to that port, then the port becomes more than a base. It becomes a pressure point. Any planner in Tehran looking at the map has to ask how much of that network could survive a determined campaign designed not to invade Iran, but to blind and blunt the maritime arm that threatens the strait. That is a dangerous question for a regime that depends heavily on the image of control. The irony is that the ceasefire may have made the Mayu more important, not less. During open war, everyone expects force. During a ceasefire, violations become tests of will. Each side tries to discover what the other is willing to tolerate. Iran appears to be testing whether it can keep a shadow campaign alive while preserving the public language of negotiation. The United States appears to be answering that shadow action with visible military readiness and carefully targeted punishment. That is not peace in the comforting sense. It is armed bargaining. The most important thing to watch now is not any single statement from Washington or Tehran. Statements are cheap. The real indicators are the ships, the flight patterns, the maritime warnings, the movement of Iranian assets, and whether attacks on commercial shipping continue. If the strait quiets down, the MIU may have done its job without firing another shot. If the attacks continue, its presence gives Washington a menu of options that are already close, already rehearsed, and already built for the geography of the problem. That is why the image of the 31st of Marine Expeditionary Unit offshore matters so much. It is not just a photo. It is a warning with engines running. It tells Iran that the old game of striking indirectly, hiding behind ambiguity, and then accusing the other side of escalation may be reaching its limit. It tells commercial shippers that the United States is preparing for more than press conferences. And it tells everyone watching the Strait of Hormuz that the ceasefire did not end the crisis. It merely moved the crisis into a more dangerous, more disciplined phase. Tehran's leaders may not want to discuss that openly on state television, because admitting it would mean admitting their coastline is no longer just their coastline, but a contested space watched by drones and satellites, shadowed by aircraft and pressured by Marines offshore. The next move belongs to Iran. But the next consequence may not. That quiet threat sits in the water now, louder than any speech, because it carries choices Tehran cannot fully predict.